Hi, this is Robert Shear with another edition of Sheer Intelligence, where the intelligence comes from my guest. And in this case, it's Shaylee Vodal. Do I have that right, Shaylee?
Kaylee Voidal.
Yes, okay. And Andy Lee Roth. And these folks are involved with an organization that I have followed from before they were born, or at least one of them was born in 1976 when I first went to work for the LA Times. But I've done a lot of alternative journalism and ramparts and everything else. And now I entered the establishment journalism for the next 30 years. And I'm interested in that date because everybody nowadays that I know blames all the ills that we have in our society, including the possibility of full blown fascism. So we're not kidding around. It's real serious, scary times. Nonetheless, it somehow all ends up being blamed not on capitalism or not on illusions about our own democratic system or what have you, or disparities of wealth. It all gets blamed on something on the internet somehow. And what interests me is that your organization, if not you, people who are now basically running it or providing a lot of the energy for it, this problem of censorship in a presumably democratic society, or certainly the arrogance of that name, certainly I know from my own personal experience, it was alive and well, censorship that is, back in 76 when you started. I know because I've gotten my own FBI files and everything. I know how they spied on organizations, but I also know how difficult it was to get a meaningful story into the New York Times. They censored Martin Luther King when he condemned the war in Vietnam, and that the year before he died at Riverside Church in their backyard. They didn't run his speech, even though it was no question news that was fit to print. So why don't you guys, working in this new environment, talk about your list of censored stories, but give me the big picture. How free is the internet and journalism? And I get the feeling from my own experience editing publications like this one that it's been really dramatically tightened up on the internet. And now it's it really doesn't even matter what the New York Times said. It's what Apple News or Google News decides to feature, and it's or Twitter, or well, all the usual suspects. But give me your take, and I want to start with the younger participant to get it really up to the moment. So, Shaylee, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, for having us. Yeah, I mean, censorship exists in all kinds of ways now. I think, especially now when we see the internet, there's all kinds of shadow banning that exists online where content is suppressed in one way or another. And now, algorithms sort of trap us in these echo chambers that are not always healthy for our sort of news diet. Um, but censorship, I guess, has always existed in the corporate media. And this year, for our top 25 list, it's the 49th cohort of students. We had 206 student researchers from 9 colleges who had worked on validated independent news stories with the help of their faculty mentors. And what happens is each student writes a summary of a news story they've identified as underreported by the corporate media, and the stories are then vetted for timeliness and credibility and, of course, corporate coverage, and then are posted to our website. And then all of the validated independent news stories from that year are shared with the faculty and the students who worked on them, along with our expert judges, our panel of professors and professional journalists and editors and so on. And they narrow down that list of sometimes over 100 to just 25. And then those 25 stories are then thoroughly researched once again by Project Censored interns to make sure they haven't been covered by the establishment press in the time that they've, since they've been submitted. And finally, the list is sent to our panel of judges once more to rank the stories to determine the top 25 order. So it's a very rigorous process in order to identify those stories that have been neglected by the corporate press and champion the independent journalism that has been sort of highlighting some of the systemic inequalities that exist in our society that the corporate media often doesn't pay attention to.
So give us the, I don't want to go through the whole list, but tell us
Sure.
the kinds of stories and the ones that jump out for you. And then Andy, jump in after that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many. We obviously 25, but we have so many environmental stories this year, which I think we see stories often about the environment routinely downplayed by the corporate media, um, and our number three story, for instance, was based on a pair of articles from the Guardian and the conversation, and it covered saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi River, infiltrating freshwater systems of the Delta region and contaminating drinking and agricultural water supplies, as well as inland ecosystems. We had a lot of stories this year that sort of concerned like big tech and social media, including the fifth story on this year's list, which was about abortion services being censored globally on social platforms, including Instagram and Facebook and TikTok after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. And women's advocacy groups called the Dobbs decision the catalyst for this widespread suppression of reproductive health information online, where platforms are sort of like overcorrecting and blocking access to certain information to avoid legal issues and regulation. Um, and then our 10th story discusses sort of generative AI's security concerns, exposing sensitive data and exposing organizations to cyber attacks. So there are always these like sort of clusters of themes that we see repeatedly every year. Environmental issues are a big one, healthcare, labor issues. But this year we saw a lot of big tech stories as well, as we're seeing, it's just kind of like constantly evolving and unavoidable now.
So, Andy, you got your doctorate in this stuff, right? At UCLA. Um, and how is this different? First of all, I mean, this was an election year, a very consequential election, Donald Trump, and the Democrats all claim censorship about something called Russiagate, which in itself has turned out to be a form of censorship because anybody who disagrees with their justification of the wars that they pursued under their own tenure as then a possible enemy agent and so forth. And here's now Donald Trump claims to be liberating the media from FBI agents and others implanted in there. And of course, he's exerting his not, inconsiderable power to shape the narratives and attack journalists who would present inconvenient truths to his story. So, kind of, can you relate this year to the historical perspective that you studied as an academic?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're both uh, new developments and important continuities. Um, on the new developments, as Shaylee's pointing out already, the role of social media and the internet in general dramatically changes the media ecosystem in ways um, that weren't in existence 50 years ago, nearly 50 years ago when the project was founded. But in terms of that, Carl Jensen, the project's founder, who started in advertising and journalism and then made his way into a career in academia at Sonoma State University, where he founded Project Censored in 1976, um, Carl understood the future, and he talked way back before the advent of the internet or even before the advent of 24/7 cable news. Carl was talking about news inflation. And the idea of news inflation being
Well,
simply
I'm
that
sorry. Oh, news inflation.
news inflation, right? So the inflationary idea that we have more and more of it, but it seems to be worth less and less. And Carl observed that in the early 90s, all right, he was talking about news inflation. Um, and I think that factor has just the idea of news inflation. You could, in some ways, think of Project Censored, its mission to promote media literacy and independent journalism, is in some ways an effort to counter news inflation. by saying, busy as we all are now, frantic as we all may be since the 2024 presidential election, here is another set of important but underreported stories that deserve your attention. And we're presenting them, we Project Censored now, we're presenting them in kind of capsule format so you can get the gist of the story in a moment or two with the sources necessary to dig deeper if you choose to. And so I think of each year's top 25 story list as we're talking about here. And this is, as Shaylee pointed out, this is the 49th cohort of students to help identify and vet the stories that constitute an annual list of, quote, censored stories. Um, I think the purpose of that is twofold. One is each individual story, of course, matters in its own right. But the other thing is that collectively, each year and across now 49 years of this process, we're tracking patterns of 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 stories, patterns of types of stories that are either marginalized or blockaded by the establishment press. And this flies in the face of the slogan, say, of the New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, or back to the days of Walter Cronkite, and that's how it is. These kind of hegemonic views of news as a simple reflection of a fixed reality. And what students who develop their critical media literacy skills by doing this kind of research at campus affiliates of the project, and what the public who taps into the story lists that we produce and our annual yearbook and other materials is how the cracks in that hegemonic facade, that news isn't a simple reflection of a fixed reality. First of all, the reality isn't fixed. And second of all, the news isn't a simple reflection. And when you look and see the systemic patterns over nearly half a century now of the kinds of stories that get covered and the kinds of stories that either don't get covered at all or get discovered in a partial, that is, incomplete or biased way, um, you don't need to be in a college classroom to start seeing that the official narrative isn't all it's cracked up to be. One of our judges, Bob Hackett, who founded Newswatch Canada, talks about how the problem with the establishment media is they focus on what went wrong today and not what goes wrong every day. So a lot of the stories, including some of the ones that Shaylee previewed a few moments ago, have to do with systemic social problems. And that's my training as a sociologist. When I first learned about Project Censored, it made such perfect sense to me because it was taking kind of a critical analysis of media and combining it with a sociological sensibility of the most pressing problems are not the dramatic singular events that constitute emergencies, but the day-to-day kind of grinding, low level, easy to ignore if you're not being impacted by them crises. And I think the project, like one of its hallmarks, is that we draw attention to reporting that digs deep that way and that has profound implications for the future of our society.
You wanted to add anything, Shalem?
Oh no, I think actually that was a perfect
Yeah,
answer.
because people who listen to this show or watch it, the main criticism I get is I interrupt too much and talk too much. And so, for 10 years now, I've been promising to shut up, and I want to stick to that. But I've also been a practicing journalist as well as consumer of news, and I, I don't want to whitewash the current situation. But as still a full time professor, teacher, 100 students or what have you, I actually find my students more effective in cutting through the bull than any students I've ever had before. Not because they are smart; they're smart in lots of ways, but the real thing is that they now have, because of the internet and its contradictions. Yes, it's the best and worst of all worlds. They can do what, as a kid, I had to do in New York: go to the 42nd Street Library, find some volumes, dig, basically change my whole lifestyle. If I can get them the least bit interested in some of these contradictions about wealth,
Hmm.
their class, war, peace, and so forth, I can then say to them, don't take my word for it. Use this as a starting point. Go outside, sit in the hallway, even in a crowded, noisy hallway. Open up one of your gadgets uh, and check it out, and they can have access to documents, to an international press because there's instant translation, and they can play. I don't like to say devil's advocate. I like to say doing critical thinking. They can challenge
Yeah.
it, but the fun part is to show that your professor's wrong. Certainly, the establishment is wrong, and we can do that about anything. Why do we have a gated campus? What was the reaction to the protests about Gaza? What's going on
Sure.
now? Isn't Donald Trump doing something good in opening up this thing with Russia and Ukraine? Well, maybe he did something good with the Gaza. He's also doing a lot of obviously bad things, intruding on the academic freedom. So it just seems to me the internet at its best is a great resource. What scares me about
Yeah.
what's happened to the internet is that established power in every country wants to tighten control of this.
Mm.
And so it's the wildness. Yes, there was a lot of wild, different, by social media. So I'll just give one example. One of our graduate students that I happen to be on the committee did a paper on social media in China during the
Mm.
pandemic in China. And it was actually very wild in terms of her research that it was difficult to control. People were
Mm.
criticizing, do we need all the vaccine this way? Should we be locked down? Are the doctors drunk? Are they corrupt? What's wrong with our system? And it was, extremely lively. And yes, and I think establishment people anywhere in the world don't like a lively debate. Take a
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sorry, yeah, I think the internet has, completely transformed the way that we consume media. And especially like, I'm a digital native. I grew up with the internet. So a lot of it is very intuitive for me. And I'm lucky at Project Censored. I work with my two colleagues, Reagan Haney and Kate Horgan, who also, share a similar experience, grew up on the internet, and are navigating this news landscape with these critical media literacy tools in mind. And that's something that we talk a lot about on our Instagram page. Reagan Haney makes these amazing infographics about, how to use TikTok and Instagram and all of these tools responsibly, because they can be a very empowering um, tool and resource if you're able to use them responsibly, and not just sharing things impulsively because they evoke an emotional response, which I think is instinct, but that's kind of the purpose of some things. And so noticing those red flags online is so important because it's like, it's this great resource. It's true. It's an amazing thing that we're able to be media makers as well as media consumers. But if we're not able to apply those critical media literacy tools and spot those red flags and notice this sort of, inflammatory, sensationalistic language that's being used, then we're just kind of like falling into the same traps that are, exist in the corporate media as well.
Andy?
Well, I would add, I mean, two things that I would want to speak to that question you ask, Robert, which is such a great question. First, we like to kind of brag informally, like Project Censored. We've been doing critical media literacy since before there was a term for it, right? But speaking to that kind of skepticism and the tools that you talk about, which are both positive things, I think the other challenge, and we've encountered this in doing. Shaylee and I have been doing a series of webinars on frame checking, that so using some teaching materials we developed over the last year. And we've had teachers saying to us, "But how do you deal with student cynicism?" Right? The challenge of teaching critical media literacy to young people who are already inclined to be skeptical about kind of establishment narratives and maybe even the corporate press is, how do we avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as it were, right? How do we harness that skepticism for positive ends rather than having it be a justification for cynicism and a kind of disengagement from any kind of politics at all? Um, And I think that's a real challenge. That part of how we address that at Project Censored is by saying, well, these tools allow people to distinguish disinformation and misinformation, for instance, but they also help young people validate legitimate, trustworthy information. And I think that's really important. Um, I think you mentioned, both of you have talked about what an important resource the internet is, and how it in many ways democratizes media participation. And I think that's an important point always to remind people to not take it for granted. But the threats to a kind of an open, accessible internet are real. And some of those are material in terms of literal access not being evenly distributed in the United States by socioeconomic status and also by region. Um, but also that kind of potential, as you said, Robert, for tight control and even cutting off. We talk about that at Project Censored as like it opens up a new area of censorship that probably didn't really exist the way it does now. When the project was founded, we talk about censorship by proxy, and the idea that, for instance, although the government is restricted by the First Amendment from imposing limits on press freedom, there's no reason that governments can't coordinate. The governments, including the U.S. government, can't coordinate with big social media platforms or big tech companies to engage in a kind of proxy censorship. And we saw that happening a few years ago, for instance, with the deplatforming of RT America in the United States. The US government, I think, for years had wanted to shut down RT America, but doing so would have involved flack. But with the Russian invasion, the second most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a popular uprising of anti Russian sentiment and pressure on the channels that distributed RT America in the United States, and they deplatformed RT America. And everyone hears RT America and thinks, "Oh, that's Russian propaganda. What's so bad about deplatforming that?" But a lot of American journalists, U.S. citizen journalists, award-winning journalists, people like Chris Hedges and Abby Martin, were deplatformed in the process. And so censorship by proxy would be one example, I think, of a form of censorship that didn't exist when the project was founded, that is technologically enabled, right, and displays some of the double-edged qualities of the power of online communication. Um,
Right.
and there are other examples of censorship by proxy. Certainly, we could talk about, without getting into it now, I would just point to the way the Israeli government has been not just using military force, but control of technology to throttle information and perspective coming out of Gaza, for instance. And so it's as blunt as internet shutdowns and as subtle as all kinds of propaganda out of Israel and in the United States as well.
Yeah, and as it turns out, the attack on TikTok seems to have been fueled by Israeli criticism and lobbyists and pressure, because there was too much of an open debate and discussion on TikTok. At least that's the latest story. But I do want to say this call for censorship comes, very often from people who present as great lovers of freedom. I forget the name of that site, News, whatever, News Guard. Brill, Stephen Brill, this guy I used to think did some good writing, is American lawyer and so forth. But nonetheless, they came after a website that I edit. They come after a lot of people, and they hire some. I think there's people who evaluate us just recently come out of a program at Yale, and they give you a 60 rating or something, and they put warnings and all that. And they actually got money from the government. It wasn't just by proxy. And they gain authority with these other companies, but these other companies are also worried about government, like whether it's Google or Apple or anything else, because they can come under regulation. And it's interesting, for all of the lousy, I can I think I'm objective, but there are lousy executive orders coming from President Trump. There was one good one. There may have been some others. but one very specific one that said that no government agents, whether an FBI or a CIA or anybody, should be working with these ostensibly private organizations like Google or Facebook, so forth, to control the flow of information. And you're getting pushback from conservative circles because they've also been censored. Let's take this word
Mm-hmm.
that we had to discuss. And the most effective censorship is when it's coded in virtue. I just want to get real news. I just want to say something historically as an old guy. Uh, Before the internet, our and yes, okay, we're better than a lot of other governments, or were. The fact is, we censored almost all of the really important things. Growing up, for example, I'm old enough to remember when baseball was racially segregated. That is something I did not learn about until Jackie Robinson came along.
Mm-hmm.
It never was discussed. It wasn't discussed in the New York Times. It was discussed in a few left wing publications, I guess, certainly in civil rights circles. Decision about how the Cold War got started, about what was the Korean War about. It remained for a lone journalist like I.F. Stone to give us some of that story. So, censorship, this thing that you guys deal with so effectively, was very powerful,
Yeah.
and even more so in a democratic society. Because when I used to travel to more clearly totalitarian societies or authoritarian ones, most of the people there, the word cynicism that used, cynicism was alive and well and healthy, I would argue, because they would say, oh, yeah, Pravda is what the party wants you to know. It's not news. Izvest is what the government branch of the Soviet Union wants to know. It's not news. They were very clear about it, even when they were members of the party, and there was a skepticism that I think saved them in the long run. In our society, in that very same period, people would say, no, we have a free press,
Yeah.
which we didn't,
The
right? We relied on the origins of every war, right up through the onset of the flowering of the internet. I think it's harder now to lie about these wars.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a notion of American exceptionalism that is enabled by the First Amendment, or or more specifically, the belief that the First Amendment means we don't have censorship in the United States, and that's of course a sort of self-congratulating falsehood that we perpetuate um, at our own risk. Um, uh, the First Amendment restricts government uh, 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 constraint on the press freedom. As we've talked about already today, there are ways that gets skirted or messed with. It says the First Amendment says nothing about corporate censorship. And the rise of corporate power in the 20th century continues to be a factor in the 21st century. Um, but I think what you're talking about, Robert, a moment ago, and the idea of history of censorship in the U.S. is very important to stress, because and one way it manifests is censorship in the U.S. is going to be often subtle in ways that it wouldn't be, say, in a totalitarian and an overtly totalitarian state, or a state that doesn't profess to have free press principles. So, a really important kind of concept to in the sociology of news production comes from the work of Daniel Holland, who talked about three zones of news coverage. There's a sphere of consensus where everyone agrees it's so, and journalistic objectivity isn't necessary there because we all agree. There is a sphere beyond the pale where journalistic objectivity isn't necessary because we agree that that's so far outside of our values that we can't be objective. And then most news operates in the kind of middle band, the sphere of what Hallen called the sphere of legitimate controversy. But the point of some of his analysis, which was premised on studies of news coverage of the Vietnam War, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, was that once you step outside of that zone of legitimate controversy, kind of notions of journalistic objectivity fly out the window. So if, going back to your example of segregated baseball earlier in American history, right? That didn't need to be treated in the news, a kind of objective news way, because it was part of the collective, however misguided it was, collective consensus that institutionalized racism was an acceptable part of American society. And part of, you can think in terms of Hallen's model, how over the history of the project Censored, like some topics move in and out of these different zones. And I think a lot of what we're seeing today with the Trump administration and how Trump talks about the press is an effort to move the status of the press as a pillar of American democracy out of the zone of consensus and into the zone of legitimate controversy. So, I'll take a moment and rattle off some statistics from various press freedom groups here. But you mentioned the election year earlier. The Committee to Protect Journalists found that back in 2019, when Trump was president, more than 11% of his 5,400 some tweets focused on criticisms of journalists or outlets, particular journalists or outlets, or contemned or denigrated the news media as a whole. Right? In this election cycle, Reporters Without Borders logged more than 100 instances of Trump insulting, attacking, or threatening the media in public speeches or offline remarks. That during just an 8-week period leading up to the November election. And during that time, the Freedom of the Press Foundation was recording more than 75 assaults on journalists in 2024. That 75 assaults on journalists in the US, home of exceptional press freedoms, right? That figure, as the Freedom of the Press Foundation noted, was a 70% increase in the number of assaults captured by the Freedom of the Press Foundation's Press Freedom Tracker in the previous year. So, I'm not interested in kind of playing a balanced game when it comes to the Trump and Trump administration policies, informal or formal, towards the press. Like, they're not interested in press freedom. They're interested in a press that's subservient to Trump and Trump's allies and their policies. And so I think we have to call that out all the time, because the work that you do and the work that the news outlets that we highlight in the yearbook every year do are all running contrary to, I think, the values and policies of this current administration.
So, and where do we go with that statement? Because it's almost the in the crowd circle I run into, that's the obligatory statement. Trump is a menace. Trump is awful. We're in a terrible situation. But I ask, how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
How did we get here? And one of the things that backfired in the criticism of Trump and caused him to get support was trying to present Trump as an agent of Russia. It was an old-fashioned McCarthyism that I was unrelenting. I mean, it's just, it was a hoax. And I think Jeff Gerth in Columbia Journalism Review documented it very well. Yet, who went after Snowden? Who jailed Julian Assange? These are not Trump. These are
Right.
his opponents. And so clearly, and if you take the distortions of the past, and now as these words are coming out of my mouth, I'm going to hear that I'm a Trump apologist, but then we can't have an intelligent discussion. If we can't, try to be objective in some way about these things, this does not mitigate the nightmare of the current moment. Okay, I have trouble sleeping, and I also feel that I'm a target of these criticisms. I'm not at all benign about it. But taking back to history, the Vietnam War, you know, uh, Lyndon Johnson just lied about the whole reason for expanding that war and attacking North Vietnam. It was an absolute lie. I wrote that story, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to write it until 20 years after the big lie, and which ended up killing, 3.5, 4.5 million Indo-Chinese people. The overwhelming majority were innocent farmers and people taking care of their children and what have you. The dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, based on its issue of lies. The Gulf Wars, before the internet was this wild, big thing, total lies. And so what I'm objecting to, yes, I think we have to be very concerned about what's going on in America right now under the
Mhm.
Trump administration. But I find it a cop out to believe that the problem somehow was created by Trump and will go away with
Mhm.
Trump or
Yes.
Elon
Yeah.
Musk or whoever the devil is of the moment. I find that a very, okay, I guess I'm editorializing, a very dangerous posture. And
Mhm.
it's intimidating in a way, right? I mean, shut up, go along now with forgetting everything else. In fact, how did Trump even here? You want an uncensored story? What was the role of our establishment legend media organizations in the creation of Trump?
Mhm.
Where
Yeah.
did he get this big television program? The whole character that was built up. I'll ask you, and you, the younger person, Shlaley. You're a product of this modern culture. How did Trump get to be this bully, be an acceptable, indeed celebrated figure for firing people, for being mean to people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when I was 18 when he was first elected, which is, I'll be 30 when he, finishes his second term, which is just like baffling to think about. And then I just felt like so hopeless. I was like, what does this say about the United States of America that we elected somebody like this? Now I feel I have a little bit more power. I still worry about, you know, um, a lot of this sort of hyper individualistic perspective of you know I guess what got Trump elected. I mean, we're thinking about the rollback of LGBTQ rights, um, gender affirming healthcare, reproductive rights, mass deportation, exacerbation of the climate crisis, like these significant threats to press freedom. And I worry that these are not issues that are as important as some of the things that affect us on an individual level. I I worry very much, but I do find it invigorating to see young people paying really close attention to the ways in which um, media and politicians are misleading them in like Andy said, more subtle ways. Maybe things are factually accurate but misleading because of the way something is framed. Um, and I see not only my colleagues but my friends who grew up on the internet calling it out and protesting and realizing that maybe electoral um, politics will not save us. The time for engaging only when there's an election is over. That is just unacceptable. There's just so much participation that can happen um, that is outside of that. And my work with the project feels so fulfilling in that way. Engaging with educators and students about issues that they really care about and are looking for in the news that they maybe are not seeing represented in the ways that they feel they should be. So I don't know how we got here. I don't really know if I have the answer to that, but I know that the future is. I feel like there is this sense of reclaiming some of the power that we didn't feel like we had when he first got elected. Like my generation of people that felt really, really helpless and hopeless, that are like, there are ways we can engage meaningfully and protect each other and pay attention so as to not, just kind of let it all, let the chaos kind of consume
But let
us,
me
I
ask
guess.
you, two of you, because censorship, that's overt. Okay, you weren't able to, and we know that, you know. And as I say, from my own experience traveling in countries that didn't have at least the pretense of freedom and so forth, most people knew they were not getting the story, and they invented their own ways of communication. There were words for it and so forth. What you said around the table, or what you say. I'm sure this is happening in Iran right now, Saudi Arabia, everybody's, people find ways of talking and developing trust. What they don't have is the illusion of being free.
Right.
They know the game is controlled.
Right.
Okay. But think about it. One reason Trump is president is we have great alienation of working people in this country, people who struggle for a living and have been not denied a decent standard of living by in a society that claimed it was always getting better. And this, if you look at the increase in income inequality, if you want a big, not just for this year, but a big story that was suppressed ever since Ronald Reagan, but it was really Bill Clinton that did the deregulation of Wall Street and the ending of the New Deal regulation. The increase, the gap in America between ordinary working people trying to make a living and the fat cats that own the media now, what used to be called Legend Media, now owned by Jeff Bezos and various other billionaires and so forth. They're setting the so-called legitimate standard that goes. It doesn't have to be censored. It's not even in the vocabulary. Class is not in the
Right.
vocabulary. The whole idea of workers' rights. Does anybody really examine the contradiction of Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post? He's a major defense contractor. His company has fought unions and is still fighting unions at every level, in the country. These things, they don't have to be censored. They don't even exist in the
Right.
vocabulary.
And one point that we make at Project Censored is that censorship doesn't have to be total. The blockade doesn't have to be total to be effective. You can find critical discussions of Jeff Bezos as the owner of the Washington Post, and what kinds of conflicts of interest that entails. Project Censored has featured all kinds of independent news outlets raising those concerns and questions. You do it in your own work, the Sheer Post, Sheer Intelligence, but part of this goes back to kind of the hegemony, I think, of the corporate media. And I liken it to the difference between McDonald's and the farmer's market, right? McDonald's has $1 billion advertising budget, and they're on every other street corner in most cities. Um, and so if you're thinking about what to have for dinner, like McDonald's, like might be easy, right? Um, uh, but the farmer's market is where you're going to find fresh, locally produced things to eat, and you might get to know the people who produce them. And I think of independent media as being like the farmers market, and it has the virtues of the farmers market, and it also has the challenges of the farmers market. So part of the project's aim is to, the term we use for the stories that are the candidates for each year's top 25 story list are validated independent news stories. And part of what we're trying to do at Project Censored is validate these independent news outlets that don't have the big McDonald's like platform from which to hold forth, but are doing high quality journalism that is, seeking and reporting the truth in a transparent and accountable way, um, and bringing that news forward. So, if we tie that back to like, where are you going to find good coverage of labor news and union organization? You're going to find some in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. Maybe once in a while there's something in the USA Today. And then, I won't take time to list the equivalent cable outlets. But everything you read in those contexts is going to be overtly or implicitly framed in terms of red versus blue politics. And you're going to see a very different set of story frames and a very different set of people treated as authorized sources, people whose insights and perspectives are newsworthy when you look at independent news coverage of labor issues. So, just to tie this in and show you like how fundamental it is, our number one story in the State of the Free Press 2025 yearbook is about labor. It's that thousands of Americans were killed or injured on the job in the last couple of years. The figure from reports by Truthout and the People's Dispatch is that on average, a U.S. worker was killed at work every 96 minutes in 2022. That, according to a Truthout report. Nearly 6,000 workers died on the job, and a startling total of 2.8 million were injured or sickened at work in 2022. That was like an almost 6% increase in the number of workplace deaths in the U.S. relative to the prior study period. That story is our number one story, partly because of its significance and partly because every major news outlet, every major corporate news outlet in the country ignored that story. They didn't report it. So, on one hand, we have Trump rising to power on emotions of resentment and victimhood, and so forth. And on the other hand, we have a corporate media ignoring actual victimhood in terms of, like, again, systemic forces, right? That many workers, a worker dying on the job every 96 minutes isn't because of random accidents. It's because work conditions are terrible. And those conditions are especially bad for workers of color, as other studies featured in our top number one story document. So we're talking about systemic inequality in terms of working people, racial inequalities compounding those inequalities, and then a lack of quote mainstream news coverage, right? And that isn't all of why we get to where we are, in answer to your big question of a moment ago, but that's certainly an important part of the puzzle that people outside of independent media aren't talking about, right? If all you do is listen to MSNBC or Fox or read the New York Times, you're probably, and except on the op-ed page of the Times, you're not going to hear arguments about that. And you're certainly not going to hear about the Bureau of Labor Statistics study documenting the incredible risks that American workers are facing every day when they go to work.
Right. And the irony, I agree with what you said. By the way, projectcensor.org, I go there quite often, and you can get the list of all these stories. It will put a lot of meat back on the bone here of what we're trying to get at. And it's an exemplary outfit. It should be taken very seriously. But I have to throw in my last little note here, not to in any way minimize what you're doing, to underscore its significance. The reason, first of all, as far as counter media, uh, independent media, that's the very thing that's being crushed in this desire to go for real news and not fake. Chris Hedges, for example, was one of the victims of that attack on RT. These people now can only pay their bills by going to something like Substack and being basically cut off from anybody that doesn't already know about them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true for people on the conservative as well as on the liberal left side. And you use the word systemic. It's because the people who own the media and have the wealth are doing just fine. They're now kissing up to Trump. The
Mm-hmm.
very same people that the Democrats counted on to love them because they're better on certain issues. No, they're all there. They paid for the inauguration. They're going to cater to them, and that'll include the Washington Post, of course, and include MSNBC and what have you. So I agree. I believe in people challenging it, but I do want to caution. Generally, both they're in agreement. Yes, Trump is really scary in many ways. On the other hand, if he can help bring peace and end the war in Ukraine, he did get a truce. If he doesn't betray that, we can get some end to the violence visited upon the Palestinian people, and it doesn't lead to even worse example of genocide than it already is. Yes, I mean we're going to be, but the point is and this is an editorial, okay, and I'll let you respond, even though we're going way over what I want to devote to this. I am worried about the lesser evil trap. I've lived with it all my life. It's a thing I've seen. And yes, now I can see it now with Trump. Everybody's telling me I shouldn't criticize the Democrats. I shouldn't say anything positive about anything Trump might do even if it ends this terrible war in Ukraine, which could really destroy all of humanity. Not to mention the if you could get some kind of sanity in Israel instead of exterminate. I mean, we're talking about existential crisis here for humanity, and I refuse to accept that just blindly waiting for the next democratic victory, and shutting up. I think that's the prescription for madness. We just have to be able to think independently. I'm not saying, I mean, you guys obviously do it effectively, but lesser evilism is that's what produced Trump,
Yeah.
and if Trump should suddenly die, there'll be others and they'll be more palatable. They'll talk a better game and so forth, and it is a trap. The Democrats did a very good job of censoring. I think the best journalist we've had in the last 10 years was Julian Assange, certainly as a publisher, and yet they have showed no mercy to him, let alone respect. I don't know what's going to happen to Edward Snowden now if the U.S. and Russia get together. Will he be forced to leave there or turned over? I don't know. It's really scary. But I just wanted to throw out that. Now, again, I shouldn't have the last word. You got a last word?
Well, I'll
Well,
just
we get.
say quickly, and we'll let Shaylee take the last word. I think on that lesser evil trap, personally, I agree with you. I agree with you almost 100%. I mean, I think just in a nutshell, quickly, I think our two-party system is clearly broken at this point. It's broken for lots of reasons, but one of them has to be involves at least an issue that Project Censored and other independent news outlets have been trying to draw attention to, which is the dark money that is corrupting our political system. So the two-party system is broken, but there remains a kind of symbiotic relationship between the DNC and the RNC on one hand and the corporate media on the other. And I think what we're seeing now is like corporate news outlets are also in extremis, and each of these things are kind of propping each other up, desperately trying to hold on, and you know they're different, I guess, end games there. The one that I believe believe in on my optimistic days and hope for all the time is that as those systems collapse, right, as the corporate media collapse, right, the legacy media are in crisis, and as the two-party system perhaps verges on collapse, that will be poised thanks to things like critical media literacy education and independent, truly independent journalism, will be poised to have better versions of those things waiting to replace the existing versions. But again, that's me on my most optimistic days. And on the days I'm not optimistic, what I try to remind myself is that, of course, it's the goal of the kind of shock and awe first X days of this new administration. And I believe it's also the goal of a lot of corporate news to have us believe that we're powerless and that there's nothing we can do, and that the best we can do is be bystanders on the sidelines watching the real players take action on our behalf. And I think whether we're talking about the Trump administration or we're talking about corporate media, the value of critical media literacy education, the value of the kind of work that Project Censored has been doing for nearly 50 years now, and the value of the independent news outlets whose work we champion is to remind people that ordinary people, when they organize together, can be effective and can have a real say in something like self-democratic decision making about our lives and what we value and the kinds of communities we want to live in. So that's my hope, I guess, in response to that. But I agree that the lesser evil threat reframes all our participation in diminished terms, and we won't get to the vision that I've just articulated by playing the lesser evil game. Shaylee.
Shalala?
Yeah. No, I mean it's like totally unsatisfying when you saw, the strategy of the left being like, well, you don't want this guy, right? Like we're better than that. And it's just like, that's not really speaking to these issues.
Yeah. You faded out there at the minute, but I'm going to wrap this up. But again, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble when I say this. There is something clarifying about how frightening this moment is. You no longer can pretend that if we just had gone along the way we were going, we wouldn't have had any big problems. The reason Trump is vital in the sense of he sells and has been able to mobilize people is we are a deeply troubled society. And I think the apathy that you're talking about here and among young people and so forth, it is largely gone.
Hmm.
I think people know whether it's your personal life or who you can date or how do we deal with sexual roles or right down the line, how do we pay for our education, how do we get assistance, do our colleges function, what is happening with artificial intelligence, where is government regulation and so forth. All of these issues are now front and center. I think you know when you got a scary change like Elon Musk running wild in the IRS Treasury Department, getting your data and everything, we're no longer having some mild discussion about personal freedom and your right to privacy or something. Boom, there it is. You could have talked yourself blue in the face about the attacks on Martin Luther King by Democrats like Lyndon Johnson, but now everybody knows that anybody who speaks up for civil rights and tries to challenge the system is going to be hounded by this government. So it is a great teaching moment, and I just want to end on a very positive note. These are the good people. This is a group that has been around, has never gotten the thanks or the respect it deserves. That has been fighting the most important fight you could be having, which is the right of the people to be informed. Otherwise, if we don't have an informed public, democracy is a charade. And in fact, the thing that's called democracy can be more dangerous than overt systems because you have the illusion that you're being educated, you're being involved, you have recourse, when in fact you don't. And so, again, projectcensored.org, is where you go. There's nice profiles of these two folks. I'm not going to repeat their credentials, but it gives you a sense of all the stuff they're doing, the work in the schools, the work, how they do their judging of the most censored. This is a great effort at democratizing education and news media, so I couldn't speak more highly of it. Let me also thank our own folks here at Sheer Intelligence, which is now hosted Sheer Post, no longer by NPR. That's a sign of the times. But our executive producer, who really insisted I do interview you too, and called me about 4 times this morning to make sure I didn't screw up, Joshua Shear, our executive producer. And by the way, our whole collection of the 10 years that we did at NPR are now available, and they'll be listed on Sheer Post so they won't be eradicated the way Chris Hedges was eradicated at RT and all that when they had to pull the plug. It'll be there. I want to thank Diego Ramos, our managing editor at SharePost, who putting this all together and writing the introduction, and Max Jones, who does the video, which gets us a much larger audience. I want to thank the JKW Foundation in the memory of Gene Stein, a great independent reporter who was one of the first uh, to speak out about what was happening to Palestinians and work very closely with Edward Said, the great academic Palestinian writer on this subject. And I know you're from Chicago. I want to thank Integrity Media in Chicago for giving us some support for this show. We very much appreciate it. And Len Goodman is an attorney there who's played a good role in defending people's rights. And so on that note, see you next. Well, no, we're no longer weekly. Free at last, free at last. At least we're no longer with NPR. We don't have to be just on Fridays. We can do it anytime. And now, whenever I can get an interesting guest and the news is happening, we can revisit it. And once again, I promise I'll keep these things shorter. But I think the stuff that we did at the end there was very valuable. So I'm happy, and we did keep it under an hour. So see ya, folks.